This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome back to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam, and I'm your host. And joining me, as is his custom, Dr. Richard Blackaby, for which this podcast is named.
That's what a coincidence. Welcome, Sam. Welcome back.
Yeah, it's good to be back. It's we had a little vacation, a little family vacation this past week down to Costa Rica.
Yeah, there's a lot of people were kind of shocked that you'd take a little 1-year-old, almost 2, to Costa Rica and not know for sure if you could come back or not.
Yeah, well, there's these newfangled guidelines to getting back into your own country, and
I think you decided if you had to get stranded, that Costa Rica was not
good a place
such a bad place.
Yeah, well, that's Carrie is quite good at deciphering what official guidelines mean and making sure we had all the right paperwork and
looking pitiful in front of customs agents.
Yeah, making sure that we are able to
breaking
squeak by.
into tears when you need to.
Yeah, but it was good. We had a great time. We spent a little time on a beach, and there was maybe a handful of people for like a mile-long beach.
Wow.
And that was really the payoff for.
What was the temperature like down there?
It was warm at the beach. Probably in the high 80s.
Oh, really?
And then we were up in the cloud forest for a while, and that was probably in the 60s, 70s.
Oh. And
that
you
was
had
really nice.
nice big private pool you were swimming in?
Yeah, we found this great house with a pool, and I think it's kind of spoiled us because I think now anytime we travel with Claire, having a private pool is just sort of like amazing because you don't have to go anywhere. You don't have to desand yourself afterwards. And, Claire she loves playing in the pool. So that was her favorite, I think.
That's actually a good segue for today's talk, Sam, because there's a lot of people with COVID and certainly travel restrictions and all of that. There's a lot of people that have just hunkered down and said, can't travel, can't go anywhere, don't want to get on a plane, or it's too complicated, or what if it's hard to get back in the country? And
we had all these thoughts too, and I would be lying if I didn't say we thought about canceling the trip. Because it's like, is it really worth it? Because there's all these just hoops to jump through and unknowns and uncertainties, and it's like now
you guys you've in just recent months this year during COVID season, you've also been to Mexico.
Well, Mexico, we did Mexico in November,
yeah, which is COVID season.
Well, sure.
Yeah, and you've been to Utah.
Mm-hmm.
Where else have you guys been since?
Colorado.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've kind of did a national park tour.
Yeah, and
so
I know you did some of that because
and
international was a little harder. So I kind of mentioned that just to say, because you guys, if our listeners aren't aware, you and Carrie are world travelers. You have a blog called Maple and Maps, and you in fact you have a goal for Claire, my 2-year-old granddaughter, to make 100 countries by the time she's 18?
Yeah.
16 or 18? 18.
18, yeah. Graduate high school.
And so she's just about to turn 2 this week. Mm-hmm. And how many has she been in so far?
I think 14.
14.
13.
That's with COVID shutting down a lot of international travel.
Yeah, half her life.
Because you were supposed to go to Peru, I think. And
we went to Peru.
Or to Argentina.
Yeah,
you're going
we were on the plane to go to Argentina.
Yeah.
March of last year. I think it was the 11th or 13th. And we're sitting on the plane on the tarmac, and we're seeing the NBA just cancel the season. Tom Hanks had got COVID, and I think travelers were banned from Europe coming into the U.S. Was about to start happening, and I mean, just when it was all kind of breaking loose.
You could actually deplane.
We said because they were, and it's still, the plane still went, but it was like, we're gonna. And it was tough because we've never done that before. And it was like, okay, I really don't know that now is the time to be in Argentina. And I followed the U.S. Embassy in Argentina. And for just months afterwards, they were just alerting U.S. citizens to like what planes you might be able to catch into Brazil to then come back to the U.S. Because it was just like, they just shut it down really fast in Argentina. So.
So what I want to talk to today about is playing it safe, and I think there's a difference between playing it safe and being prudent. And this is a tough one because especially if there's things that are fearful out there, we tend to there's some people who live in fear, who always do the most conservative, careful thing. And I guess it depends on what you're dealing with. If you're dealing with, radioactive material, it's probably wise to do that.
Yeah.
If you are just living your life and you just sort of carefully, cautiously, never take risks, never venture out, always take the most cautious way of doing things. Sometimes I think you can look back at the end of your life or in the end of your leadership and say, was that what it was called for, to just always do the safest thing? Because there are opportunities to be had. And as you were telling me today, Costa Rica was beautiful, not crowded. Things were available, no lines to wait in to go get meals, whatever. There was, in the midst of COVID, there were some opportunities that turned out great. Direct flight from Atlanta. So I'd do a travel bureau, but and so I want to talk for a moment just about that. And I know when COVID first really began to strike, I was struck by a passage in Luke chapter 19. And the first 10 verses in Luke 19 is, of course, the great story about Zacchaeus. And when that story is done, Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. He's getting near the city, and he feels compelled. The disciples are asking, basically, is this it? I mean, is this the end times? Is it all kind of wrapping up here now? And so Jesus says, he tells a story, and he says, there was a nobleman traveling to a far country to receive for himself authority to be king. By the way, most people feel like this is probably referring to based on the story of King Herod. It's not the story, but that's what King Herod had to do. He had to actually go to Rome, and the emperor of Rome had to make him have the authority to be king over Judea. And so Jesus listeners would be familiar with this process, that you go away to be made king over your land. And the people didn't like Herod. They didn't want him to be king. And so he says, so as this noble's getting ready to leave, he brings in 10 of his servants, and he gives them each a mina. And a mina was a Greek amount of money that was equal to about 100 days' wages, about 3 months' wages. So not a massive fortune. Like Matthew talks about talents, which was much, much more. This is about 1/60th or so of a talent. So it's much smaller amount. 10 of them are given them. But he says something interesting in verse 13. He gives them the mina, and then he says, engage in business until I come back. That's all he tells them, and then he leaves. And there's several things fascinating about that. For one, if you've ever engaged in business, you know what that involves. It involves looking for opportunities, looking for customers, looking for sales, looking for new markets, for possibilities. It means basically have an entrepreneurial spirit that looks for what maybe others are missing, but where there might be a great return. And I love that idea. Look for the possibilities. Engage for business. And the thing that's interesting is it says that the citizens of that country hated the man who was going to be the king. They didn't want him to be the king. And then that was the case with Herod as well. They actually sent delegations urging Rome, don't let this guy be our king, which didn't work. And so think about trying to do business in a land where everybody hates your boss. And so you think, oh, I've got a mina here. Maybe I can invest it in this local ice cream stand. And then they ask you, well, whose money is this? Who are you investing for? Who's our silent partner? And you say, well, it's that noble. And they respond, we hate him. If that's him, I don't want to do business.
Yeah.
So how do you do business in a land where everybody hates your boss? It's not that easy to do. I mean, you got to be pretty creative. It's one thing to say engage in business, but what if nobody wants to do business with you? And we often miss that in the parable here. But it's not easy to do that. You're in a society that is predisposed against who you work for. But nonetheless, eventually the noble comes back. He's been made the king. And the first servant comes up and he says, you gave me a mina, it's made 10. And I like the way it says that. It says, your mina has earned 10 more minas. Well, yeah, it was his mina, but it didn't just miraculously, one day you look in that shoebox.
Just propagate.
Yeah, it's like, I put 1 mina in that shoebox and now there's 10 in there, it's breeding.
Yeah.
No, he had to go look for business, and he took that 1 mina and he had a 10-fold return. And you don't get a 10-fold return by playing it safe.
No.
You don't get a 10-fold return taking the most cautious investment possible. And anyone who invests knows that any investment that has the potential for a large gain also has the potential for a large loss. The only way to make a lot of money is typically to run a lot of risk and to have the nerve to do that. And so this servant apparently was willing to take that risk, and he came back with a 10-fold return. And so, of course, the master says, well done, good servant. Because you've been faithful in a very small matter, have authority over 10 towns. And then the second person, he had gotten his up by 5, which is still 5 times the investment. That's a great return. And so he's given 5 cities as well to oversee. But then the third guy comes, and of course he's afraid. He says, I kept it safe because I was afraid of you. Basically, he's driven by fear. And so he says, I basically he buried it, kept it in the ground, and look, I didn't lose a thing. He says, you gave me a mina. Here's your entire mina back, just the way you gave it to me. And of course, he's condemned. And it's taken. What he did have is taken away. He loses it by playing it safe. He's so afraid of losing that he plays it safe, and then he loses his investment as a result. And so the things that I've just noticed about this that I think are so important for us, especially in this time, to be noticing, is that number one, you can either be driven by possibilities or by problems. Two of the servants looked for the possibilities. The third one looked at the problems. Well, my boss is very hard to deal with. He'll be very upset if I lose this. I'm in a country where people don't like my boss, so it's really going to be difficult to find anyone to do business with. So better just to play it safe. And so one is driven by the problems, and the others say, yeah, but even in this context, there are possibilities. Let's look for them, and they find them. The other is that some people are driven by fear. They're more afraid of what they will lose than they are excited about what they could gain. Some people are always about where's the gain, where's the possibilities. Others are all about what might we lose if we're not careful, and so they're driven by fear. And I'm seeing that particularly in society today, where for various reasons there are many people driven by fear, and I'll see this. We back at Thanksgiving, we all ran a Thanksgiving 10K run, and we took and of course we're all run. It was a virtual run. I'm not virtual. We did the run, but we weren't in a crowd of 16,000 or however many there are in the Peachtree Run. Instead, we just found our own course, running around a golf course in neighborhood, and it was just the 5 of us running. And we took a picture afterward of having run 10K on Thanksgiving morning. And I had a couple of friends who just commented about, well, where's your masks? You're out running 10K and you're not wearing a mask. And it's like, well, it's like my wife, and it's my kids, people that I work with every day.
You're outdoors.
And we're outdoors. Yeah. But, so, I mean, I do wear a mask when I go to Walmart or I go to a restaurant or wherever I go. But just to say, but we ran 10K on Thanksgiving morning, and none of us obviously got infected. None of us were around it at the time. And so I was just thrilled that we could do that, to go into Thanksgiving having run 10K already. But some people were like, oh, you went outside, like on public streets? What if you were to catch something? And of course, there could, I suppose, be a chance of coming across someone, but at some point you sort of weigh the risk. You try to be prudent. Certainly, whenever we passed anybody, we gave a wide berth and didn't cough or open our mouth or inhale. We kind of had until we got past. But I look at that and I just say, you can live your life in fear of what you might lose, but then there will be circumstances where you won't gain either. You'll miss opportunities.
Yeah.
And so when it comes to leading, you've got to ask yourself, am I leading based on fear? Am I leading based on trying to avoid problems? Or am I leading based on looking for possibilities? Am I hoping for what can be gained? Or am I fearful, just afraid of losing? And what you notice that Jesus is the one who tells this parable, and he concludes and says, basically, there's no reward for playing it safe. The one who played it safe is the one who's condemned, and has what was given to him is taken away.
Yeah.
And so in the kingdom of God, there's no reward for the guy who just plays it safe. And I think that's important to realize, especially today, and I would say especially for the church, and especially for Christians today. When you look at the state of society, you look at North America and where it's at right now, and you have to conclude this is not a time for Christians to be playing it safe, especially when it comes to the kingdom of God, and for churches to play it safe. This is a time for churches to take risks. This is a time for churches to be driven more by the possibilities than by what problems they have to face right now, what regulations they have to abide by. You can see all that, but then say, but where are the possibilities today, even with COVID, even with polarization and racial discord and everything else? Are there possibilities in a time like this? And so we'll take this, the remaining moments in a moment here, just to talk about that.
Yeah. Well, let's unpack that right after the break. Once a quarter, Richard Blackaby gives a conference call devotional for marketplace leaders in partnership with Workforce Ministries. Connect with this call via Zoom or on the telephone. The next call will be held on Wednesday, February 24th at noon Eastern Time. Visit workforceministries.org for the phone number and for the Zoom link. Links will also be in the show notes. So, Richard, I love this passage that you've highlighted for us in Luke, and I think a lot of people might be surprised by the harshness of the punishment that happens to the guy who saved the mina. It's like, hey, you gave me something, I didn't lose any of it.
Yeah.
And he's like, well, hey, at least he didn't lose anything, but quite the opposite happens to him, and I think that might surprise people.
Yeah.
And so maybe just in the last few minutes of our time here, let's just unpack what that means for us in our lives.
Well, sometimes the church sometimes has really gotten off on this thing about, well, it's not about the numbers. God's not into, as long as you're faithful. God doesn't care about how fruitful you are. He just wants you to be faithful. And I'd say, well, don't look at that parable then, because that parable, the one who, the ones who get rewarded are the ones whose numbers go up.
Yeah, and I guess it would. It depends on how you define faithful too.
Yeah. See, this guy would say, I was faithful because I didn't lose anything.
Yeah.
And the master here, Jesus, the storyteller, would say, no, the ones who were faithful were the ones that multiplied what was given to them. And so I realize it's different. I don't want to get too hard on people numbers wise, but I know, for instance, churches that have not grown in years, but the same handful of people keep faithfully meeting and having services, and they would say, well, we're faithful, we keep meeting. But they're not reaching their community. Nobody in their neighborhood has been reached for Christ. But this handful of faithful keep meeting, and so they think that they're faithful. Yeah. But they're not growing. They're not reaching anyone.
Yeah, and I guess you would, again, just come back to that definition of faithfulness. Like, faithful to what? Faithful to meet? Was that what you were called to do? To meet regularly as a church, faithfully?
Right.
Or was it something else?
Yeah. and pastors who keep preaching, but there's never any decisions made. The congregation never grows, but they're faithful to preach. But maybe they're not preaching very well, and so no one is coming, no one's attracted, but they're faithful to keep doing the same thing they've always done, even if it's not very well done. But what is clear from here is Jesus is saying, no, I want to see growth. I want to see increase of some kind. And it's even in this parable, it doesn't mean it's the same amount of growth for everybody.
Right.
But is there some way in which you are engaged in business? Like in business, people understand. If you never sell anything, if you never have any new customers, but you say, but I was faithful because I went to the store every day and I opened it up and I sat behind the counter even though we never sold anything. That's not faithful. That's called bankruptcy. But in the church, we do that in the church all the time, and we call it faithful. And so I think it's interesting when he says engage in business. He's kind of using a term that business people understand. We understand it's about growth and numbers. And so, there's lots of ways to apply that. But I think the main thing is, have an entrepreneurial spirit about you that as you go out into every day, you're looking for the possibilities. It might just be having lunch at the office and you look around and realize, there's a staff person I've never really gotten to know. Maybe today I'm going to just intentionally sit with him and talk with him, get to know him. Or maybe there's just, when I go to work, I realize, instead of just doing the same thing I do every day, maybe there's some new things I could do, some new possibilities. And I've talked about this before, but when COVID hit, I'm up to, I think, over 60 trips now that have been canceled because of COVID. So all of a sudden my calendar is freeing up. Now I can either sit there and look at a calendar that's suddenly gone blank when it was totally full with international travel and domestic travel, or I stopped and I thought, well, what can I do? And I ended up, I think, overhauling about 5 different books that the Blackabees or my dad has written in the past, and wrote a new book, took on a bunch of projects. I decided to start running seriously. And in about 2 weeks, I'm scheduled to run my first half marathon, which scares me to death. But
it should.
Do you remember when you were calling me accountable about running the 10K?
I do. I remember
that. So I don't know if I can make it or not. But you know what?
The fact that you're attempting it that says something.
That's to me, that is trying to get the 10 minutes. It's saying I could either feel really bad about COVID and having to wear a mask all the time, or I could start running more and push myself to try to reach a goal I never thought ever that I would even be able to entertain.
Well, I remember when we first started this podcast that I think your goal was, just a 5K.
Then. Without having to stop partway through and call an ambulance.
Yeah.
And
that's great.
And now to think I'm going to try for 13 miles.
13.1.
Yeah, 13.1. Yeah, that 0.1 could be the difference maker right there. I looked at that and I thought, are there possibilities here? And again, that's never to minimize all the bad,
right? But
it's to say, with all the bad, can there be some good that is seized even from this? There's lots of businesses that have done that. A lot of restaurants, for instance, that have put various kinds of dividers up between tables. They've gone into very aggressive takeout and pickup that they didn't have before. They've advertised on differently, offering maybe free delivery or different incentives.
Yeah, well, they adapt, and it's a matter of survival for them.
And then all of a sudden it's like, well, hey, we instead of just saying, woe is us, we don't have customers now, they pivoted. They found other ways to service customers, and they did it better than other restaurants were, so they stayed in the game, and they got a 10-minute return because word's out. Hey, if you want a safe, easy way to get good food delivered, then use them. So I've seen churches doing that, and my dad was always good at that. He was you could call him a spiritual entrepreneur, but he was constantly looking for what the possibilities were with God. And so, quite famously, we moved up to Canada, and the very first day we get there, there's like 10 people left in the church welcoming us. And before that day's out, my dad's already started his first mission church, and people people were constantly telling my dad, "Are you crazy? Like, you've only got 10 people. You can't start a mission. They can't even pay you a salary for your family. Well, why would you bring your associate up with you?" And then one of the first missions he starts is 500 miles away in Winnipeg. And it's like, you got to be crazy. Like, you can't start a church 500 miles away. Like, how are you going to deal with that? And so on. Constantly doing things that seem foolhardy, risky. I can't tell you how many times people told my dad he was crazy. That if he followed through with that crazy idea, he would sink his own church. Like, your church will, just think of what you could lose. I remember the church he started 500 miles away. People just said, that's just, you're overextending. That's too much. But my dad felt like God wanted us to do that. And very quickly we got a pastor and he took it and ran with it. But interestingly, years later, that church 500 miles away became my church. That was the first church I ever was called to. And so my dad, when everyone's telling him, "Are you crazy to start a church over there?" has no idea that his oldest son will cut his teeth on that very church a few years later. And so you think, what if he'd saved himself? What if he had said, "No, let's not overextend ourselves"? Would have had a direct impact on me. Your wife, in fact, was born in that city.
Yeah.
So you know, you look back and
that church.
You just say, you know, some people keep seeing the possibilities. And so, like, I remember people would say to my dad, they would say, well, why is it that so much stuff always happens around him? And then I heard people say, well, nothing like that ever happens around me. But it sounds like, for some reason, it's like God plays favorites. He's always doing stuff around your dad. And my dad would say, well, no, it's the very same God who can do just as much around you. The difference is, are you willing to take the risk? Are you willing to venture out when your heart starts racing and you have this sense, I can't believe this. I think God may be asking me to write my first book or go on that mission trip when I don't know how I'm going to afford to do it, or start that business on the side I've always wanted to start but never thought I could pull it off. And there's just so many ways in which God can motivate you and stretch you to do things that you never dreamed that you would do. It's kind of like Moses. You know, for years he's herding sheep in the backside of the desert and watching the news every night saying, man, it just looks so bad there in Egypt. You know, I wish God would do something about those Israelites. And then all of a sudden one day there's a burning bush and God says, hey, by the way, I'm going to do something about those Israelites. Oh, good. God, I've been praying about that. I'm really glad you're going to do that. And then God says, I'm going to use you. And all of a sudden there's this crisis of belief. Well, think about what I could lose. I'm a wanted man there. I've never done that. I don't have that skill set. You're asking me to do stuff I'm not good at. And God would be saying, but look at the possibilities.
Yeah.
Look what could happen if you trusted me and did something you've never done before. Just think how many people would be blessed because you took a risk. You didn't play it safe. Moses, you could play it safe and just live out the rest of your days herding sheep in the desert, and no one's going to want to kill you. No Egyptian army is going to chase after you. But you also will look back on your life and realize pretty nondescript, ordinary life. He lived, he died, didn't do anything of significance, and now he's gone. Or you take some risk and you look back and realize that was the greatest single thing that your life ever did. And the one thing you'd never want to look back on and do differently is when God told you take that risk. And so I look at churches doing stuff. I see pastors live streaming. They'd never done that before, and all of a sudden, they're, of all things, they're live streaming around the world, and people are being impacted around the world by what's happening in their church. I see people writing their first books, and I help people almost every week trying to figure out, how do I get this book published? And I'm scared. I've never done this before, but I just feel like it's something God wants me to do, and I'm going to do it. And people that leave comfortable jobs and positions because they know they only live once, and they just don't want to spend the rest of their life just playing it safe, doing the same thing. When I've known people that left very well-paid, comfortable jobs and went into ministries where they weren't sure where they get paid. but they love what they did. They love the impact they were having. They love the thrill of just of their heart racing every week, saying, "Will we make payroll? Will this work or not?" There's a great, maybe disclose. There's a great quote by Hunter Thompson. I don't agree with all of Thompson's views. In fact, full disclosure, he ultimately committed suicide. So he didn't end his life quite necessarily the way he describes it. But I do like his quote. I think it pictures this whole theme well. He says, "Life should not be a journey to the grave in a pretty and well-preserved body, but rather to skid in broadside in a cloud of smoke, thoroughly used up, totally worn out, and loudly proclaiming, 'Wow, what a ride.'" And of course, he ended up committing suicide about age 67. I think he kind of skidded in and decided to end it all. But I love that approach to say, what do you hold back when you cross the finish line, when you enter into heaven, when you stand face to face with God? Do you think that God's going to say, "Well done"? You hardly exerted yourself throughout your whole life. You never took a risk. You never stretched yourself. Look at all that money that you left behind in the bank because you never invested it in my kingdom. And look at all the energy you saved so that you could have it when you got to heaven instead of spending it on earth to change your world. I don't think we'll be rewarded for playing it safe. I don't think we'll be rewarded for being foolish.
Yeah.
But when God puts something in your heart and it scares you to death, that may really be the most you've ever lived, is in those moments. So for our listeners, I just say, if there's something God has been sort of percolating in your spirit, something that maybe for years you've thought that God wanted you to do, and you've just never had the courage, the craziness to do it, this is the time, I think, for God's people to stop playing it safe and to go for it with God and change their world.
Well, that's a great place to leave it.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.